She told me about the garnet brooch before I'd opened a single box. I was standing on the front porch of my grandmother's house, with a moving blanket draped over one arm and a house key I hadn't quite gotten used to holding when my neighbor walked across the grass and said, "You know, Elaine always kept her brooch in a blue velvet pouch, the one with the frayed drawstring." She said it the way you'd say something obvious, like she expected me to nod along. I didn't nod. I said something vague and went inside and stood in the kitchen for a long time before I could make myself move again. My name is Hadley Carver, and 14 months before I moved to Ashwood, Oregon, I was a married woman living in a two-bedroom apartment in Phoenix with a man named Martin who laughed too loud at his own jokes and made the best scrambled eggs I've ever eaten. Martin died on a Tuesday in October on a highway outside of Scottsdale when a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. He was 34. He was on his way home from a conference. He had texted me 11 minutes before the crash to ask if I wanted Thai food. I tell you this not because grief is the point of this story, but because it's the reason I moved in the first place. Martin and I had talked about inheriting my grandmother Elaine's house someday. We'd talked about the garden she kept, the wide porch, the town that was small enough to feel like something held together on purpose. After he died, I spent 8 months in Phoenix watching other people's lives continue at normal speed while mine had stopped. And then one morning I looked at my estate paperwork and realized I already had a different place to go. I told 5 people I was moving: my mother Ruth, my older sister, my therapist, my estate attorney, and a colleague covering my caseload while I was on leave. I made no announcement. I drove north in early March with my car packed so full I could barely see out the rear window, pulled into the gravel driveway of a pale yellow house on a street called Sycamore Bend, and tried to feel something other than tired. My neighbor's name was Agnes Putnam. She was 68 years old and lived in the brick bungalow next door, the one with window boxes full of sweet alyssum and a small flag with a heron painted on it near the mailbox. She brought me a loaf of lemon bread on my second day. She seemed like the kind of woman who had lived alone comfortably for a long time, who had filled that solitude with plants and routines and small courtesies for the people around her. She smiled at me the way a certain kind of older woman smiles at a younger one, who looks like she's been through something. Like she already understood the general shape of it. I assumed she was just perceptive. I told myself the brooch comment had been a lucky guess, or something my grandmother had mentioned to her at some point over the 12 years they'd been neighbors. I told myself that was a reasonable explanation and tried to leave it alone. In April, Agnes mentioned that my grandmother used to call me Hattie when I was very small. No one has called me that in 22 years. The last person who used it with any regularity was my grandfather, who died when I was 9. My mother stopped using it after he passed. I have never told anyone about that nickname. I have never put it in writing that I know of. I had certainly not mentioned it to a woman I'd known for 6 weeks. I started writing things down after that. Not a diary exactly, just dated entries. What she said. Where I was standing when she said it. April 14, the nickname. May 3. Agnes mentioned offhand that Martin had been a physical therapist. That was accurate, and I had not told her. I had mentioned I'd lost my husband. I hadn't told her what he did for work. I hadn't told her his name either. She'd used his name by then. She said Martin sounds like someone who would have loved this town while we were both pulling weeds along our property line. And when I looked up, she was already looking back down at the ground. By June, I had half a notebook filled. My estate attorney had referred me once to a private investigator named Corinne Bast, a woman in her mid-50s who operated out of an office in Eugene and had the manner of someone who had spent decades not being surprised by anything. We met in person because I'd decided I was done making decisions over the phone. I brought my notebook. She read it in about 4 minutes, then looked up and said, "You were right to come in." I paid Corinne $3,500 over 6 weeks. She billed me in phases, which I appreciated, because each phase delivered something that required sitting with before I was ready for the next one. Her first report covered the obvious: Agnes John Putnam, born 1956 in Corvallis, Oregon. Retired. Widowed at 52. No children on record, no criminal history. She had moved to the brick bungalow on Sycamore Bend 11 years ago. No apparent connection to Martin, to Phoenix, to anyone in my life in the last 15 years. Corinne flagged one detail: the timing of Agnes's move. She had purchased the bungalow 8 months after my grandmother Elaine bought the house on Sycamore Bend. Not before, after. The second report was the one I had to read 3 times. Agnes had been employed for 16 years at a private family services organization based in Lane County, the kind that had handled independent adoptions in the years before the state consolidated those processes under public agencies. She had worked as an intake coordinator and later as a case manager. She retired from that position in 2009. The records Corinne obtained through public filings and a contact at the county clerk's office showed that the organization had processed one adoption in particular, a private placement of a newborn girl in the summer of 1969. The adoptive parents were identified only by a case number. The birth mother was listed as a minor, 17 years old. Corinne made one more call. She spoke with a retired administrator who had worked at the same organization decades later and still remembered the file, because it was one of the ones that had stayed with her. She confirmed off the record that Agnes Putnam had not merely worked at the organization at the time of that adoption. Agnes had been the birth mother in the 1969 file. My mother Ruth was born in the summer of 1969. She was adopted as an infant. My grandmother Elaine had always told her the adoption had been closed. No names exchanged, no contact, a door that shut cleanly behind all of them. I spent most of a Saturday in my grandmother's kitchen with that information. I made coffee I didn't drink. The lemon bread Agnes had brought me the day before was still sitting on the counter, and I stood there looking at it for a while, like it was something I couldn't quite place. I didn't go next door that day. I have learned since Martin died that moving too quickly towards something heavy makes you more likely to drop it. I waited. I kept gathering. I asked Corinne to go one level deeper. It took 3 more weeks and a conversation Corinne had with my grandmother's longtime attorney, who was in his 80s, who had known Elaine for 40 years, and who seemed to feel that the time for certain silences had passed, to understand the full shape of what I was looking at. My grandmother Elaine had known. Not everything, and not at first, but in the last decade of her life, she and Agnes had somehow found each other. Corinne believed it had started with a property they'd both expressed interest in through a local listing, a bureaucratic coincidence that had put them in correspondence. Over the years that followed, my grandmother had learned who Agnes was, what she was, and Elaine had done what Elaine always did with difficult things. She'd made a quiet decision without telling anyone, and lived inside it for as long as it held. She hadn't kept written records for Agnes. Instead, she had told her things. In phone calls and occasional visits, she had described Ruth's life. She had described mine. She had told Agnes the nickname Hattie, the way I used to line my shoes up perfectly by the door. She had described Martin, his job, the way he laughed. And when Elaine's health began to fail, she had done one more thing. Her attorney wouldn't confirm it outright, but Corinne pieced it together from the timing. Elaine had told Agnes that the house on Sycamore Bend would pass to me, and Agnes had bought the brick bungalow next door 8 months later. I called my mother on a Wednesday evening and asked her without any preamble whether she had known Agnes Putnam existed before I mentioned my neighbor 3 months ago. There was a pause long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. I found her through an ancestry website, my mother said. Her voice had the careful sound of someone choosing words from a very short list. 6 years ago, I did a DNA test on a whim and her name came up as a close biological match. I reached out. We've spoken a few times. A pause. I didn't tell you because I didn't know what it meant yet. And then more time kept passing and I didn't know how to start. I asked if she had known Agnes lived next door to Grandma Elaine. She said she hadn't known that until recently. Agnes had told her after Elaine passed. I asked if she had known that Agnes moved in next door to me. She was quiet. I knew Agnes was aware the house was going to you. I didn't know she had actually moved there until a couple of months ago. I should have told you. I didn't know what to say. I told her that my entire life I had understood my grandmother's version of the adoption story to mean the door was permanently closed, that there was no one left behind it, no thread remaining, and that she had let me believe that while knowing there was a woman 6 years into her life who shared her DNA, and another woman who had been receiving detailed accounts of my childhood from my grandmother for over a decade. My mother cried quietly. I let her. Then I said I'd call again in a few days, and I hung up, and I sat very still in the house Elaine had left me. Agnes came to my door on a Friday morning. I hadn't told her what I'd found. She must have sensed something had shifted, the way people do when what they've been holding becomes visible in the room. She was carrying a rectangular cookie tin with a winter scene painted on the lid. Bare trees, a farmhouse, snow on everything. She stood on my porch and didn't make excuses. She said, "I think you know more than you did when you moved in. And I think I owe you the truth, more than I owe myself the comfort of waiting for the right moment." I opened the door and let her in. She sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, the same one where Elaine had peeled apples and written her Christmas cards, and I now realized probably talked to Agnes on the phone, and she set the tin between us. She said it was for me to keep, that I could do whatever I wanted with what was inside. Then she asked if I would let her explain first, before I looked at anything. I said yes. She talked for nearly 2 hours. She was 17 when she got pregnant. The father was a boy she'd dated briefly who left for college and stopped answering her letters. Her parents were not in a position to help her raise a child, and in 1969 the options available to a girl in her situation were very few and none of them were easy. She didn't want me to think she hadn't wanted to keep the baby, because that wasn't the truth. She had wanted to very much. She had held Ruth for 20 minutes in the hospital before the nurses came. She had given her a name, but that name didn't follow the child into her new family. In the years after, Agnes had tried to find ways to know if Ruth was okay. Not to interfere, just to know. She had contacted the placement office twice in the 1980s and been told the file was sealed. She had registered with the early reunion registries in the 1990s and heard nothing. She did the DNA test herself in 2017, and my mother's name appeared on her screen that November like something she'd stopped expecting. They had spoken carefully and not often. My mother had needed time, and Agnes had given it without pressure. When Elaine died and my mother mentioned that the house on Sycamore Bend would pass to me, Agnes had looked up the address, seen the brick bungalow next door come available, and made a decision she said she couldn't explain cleanly and didn't try to. "I wanted to know you were real," she said. "Your grandmother had described you to me for years. I just wanted to see that you were a person and not just a collection of details I'd been given. I wasn't going to say anything. And then your first week here, you were carrying boxes across the porch and you looked so tired, and I thought about what Elaine had told me after your husband died, and I said too much. I've kept saying too much." I looked at her across my grandmother's table for a while after she finished. Then I opened the tin. There were photographs. A few of my mother from what looked like the mid-1970s, school photos, the kind that get copied and passed around and occasionally circulate in ways that are hard to trace. A few of me. I recognized one from my college graduation, which my mother had posted somewhere online years before. One of Martin. He was standing in front of our Phoenix apartment with his arms crossed and squinting into the sun, grinning. I didn't recognize it at first, then I remembered. My mother had posted it once years ago, a casual photo from a visit. I hadn't thought about it since. At the bottom of the tin was a single folded piece of paper. Agnes pointed to it and said it wasn't hers. It was a note my grandmother had left her the last time they'd seen each other in person, about 2 months before Elaine died. I unfolded it. My grandmother's handwriting, the same slanted cursive from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the letter she'd sent when I got my first apartment. It said, "She doesn't know your name yet. I made the choices I made, and I kept the peace the best way I knew how, and I am sorry that wasn't enough for both of you at the same time. Give her room. She has more patience than she shows." I read it twice, then I folded it and put it back. I told Agnes what I had told my mother, that wanting to know someone's life and taking pieces of it without asking are not the same thing. That whatever grief she had carried since 1969 did not entitle her to buy the house next door to mine without my knowledge, or to let details of my life drop into casual conversation as though she had already earned the right to hold them. That whatever this was supposed to become between us, it would have to start from zero, and only if I decided I wanted that. She nodded. She didn't argue, didn't soften it, didn't offer anything that sounded like a counter. She said that was fair, and she said it like she meant it, and then she stood up and walked home. I didn't reach out for a month. I needed time to think. I also needed to talk to my mother again, which we did. Twice, in long phone calls, where some things were said that were years overdue, and some things were cried over, and some things were left alone, because not everything needs to be finished in a single conversation. My mother and I are still working on it. I think we will be for a while. That doesn't feel like a bad thing to me anymore. It just feels like the truth. On a Sunday in late July, I opened the cookie tin again and went through it more slowly. I found a photograph I'd missed the first time, a small, slightly overexposed print of a young woman, 17 at the most, maybe younger looking, sitting in a hospital chair holding a newborn. The young woman was looking at the camera but not really seeing it. She had the expression of someone trying to memorize something before it's taken away. The newborn was wearing a yellow knitted hat. My mother has told me, her whole life, that she was brought home from the hospital in a yellow knitted hat. My grandmother had kept the hat in a cedar box in the hall closet until she died. It's in a bin in my bedroom now. I called Agnes on a Monday afternoon and asked her to come over. I didn't forgive her that day. I said so, directly, because honesty is one of the few things you can offer at the beginning of something uncertain. I told her I hadn't worked out what I wanted from whatever this was, and that some days I felt the anger of having been observed and catalogued from a distance my entire life without ever being asked. And other days I found myself looking at that photograph and feeling something I didn't have a clean word for. She said she understood. She didn't push for more than that. I asked her to tell me about Ruth's birth. She did, quietly without tidying it up. She described a summer in 1969 when she was 17 years old, and the world had very little patience for girls in her situation. She made no attempt to make it more palatable than it was. When she cried once, near the end of it, she didn't apologize. We had coffee. We sat in my grandmother's kitchen for a long time after she finished. She comes over on Tuesdays now. We don't have a name for what we are. I don't call her anything beyond her name. I'm not ready for more than that, and she hasn't asked me for it. My grandmother planted irises along the south side of the house decades ago. They come up every spring without anyone tending them. Agnes knows their names. Not just iris, but the specific heritage cultivar, one Elaine had apparently sourced from somewhere she'd been proud of. Agnes has been showing me which ones need to be divided before the ground hardens in the fall. This past Tuesday, she was crouched near the bed, showing me where to cut, when she stopped and looked at the row of them for a quiet moment. Then she said, in the careful voice she uses when something matters. She talked about you like you were the best thing she'd ever watched from a distance. I didn't answer right away. I pressed the soil down around the rhizome I'd just replanted and made sure it was sitting level. Then I said, tell me more about her when you come next week. She said she would. We finished in the garden, and I went inside to wash my hands, and through the window above the sink I watched her walk back across the grass to the brick bungalow. Moving the way she moves, deliberate, unhurried, like someone who has learned to go around grief rather than through the center of it. I've stopped keeping the notebook. I don't need to track what she knows anymore. That question has been answered, and the answer turned out to be something larger than the question I'd started with. What I'm doing instead, slowly, without any particular deadline, is learning the shape of a story that was already mine long before I knew it existed.